Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, How to Implement Supply Chain Planning Software. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm Kristen Tiley, the Director of Marketing here at Arqiva, and I will be your moderator today. Discussing the topic is Sujit Singh, COO here at Arqiva. Sujit, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Hey, yes, thank you, Kristen. Yeah, I've been with Arqiva 25 plus years and have been implementing supply chain planning software for a lot of those years. So happy to be here and share some of my experiences.
Awesome, thank you. We do have a few announcements before we begin. If at any point you have trouble hearing us, please let us know using the chat feature and we'll be sure to assist you. We do have a few polling questions in today's session, so we encourage you to participate in those when they come up. And there will be time at the end of the presentation for questions, and you may submit an online question at any point using the questions window. And before I hand things over to Sujit, I'd like to share a little bit about Arqiva. For more than 30 years, Arqiva has helped global enterprises drive business transformation through improved supply chain processes. Recognized by Gartner in the Gartner Supply Chain Planning Solutions Magic Quadrant, everything we do is aimed at solving complex planning challenges and creating cutting-edge technology that enables you to run your business at peak performance. We continually challenge ourselves to create solutions that not only solve today's challenges, but future challenges as well. We live in a dynamic world where speed, accuracy, and efficiency are critical to drive business transformation, and we believe that starts with better planning. Our goal is to enable your business to benefit and thrive from the way our solutions unlock the true value of your supply chain. Our fully integrated S&OP solution is a demand-driven business planning process that promotes cross-functional synchronization within the company, starting from integrated financial planning to demand and inventory management to create a more dynamic S&OP management process using real-time dashboards. And with that introduction, I'll hand things over to Sujit.
Thank you, Kristen. Okay, so let's look at the agenda for today. Last month, we had presented a webinar on how to go about selecting a software. So we'll start with a recap of that, and then we'll jump into the topic for today. We'll talk about how to lead with business value, what might be the seeds of change you have to look at within the organization as you go through this process. And then we'll get into a little brass tacks about scope of work, data design, workshop, design workshop, kickoff meeting. We'll talk about our favorite methodology of delivering these projects, the rapid iterative delivery, and then we'll conclude from there. Let's jump right in. Last month, we presented a webinar on how to select a supply chain planning solution, and implied in there was selection of the solution as well as the vendor. And so in there, we talked about you should begin with understanding and identifying your business needs, really write them down in detail. This may require a committee approach. And then from there, research and create a list of vendors to evaluate, which may require you to look at outside third parties to create such a list. This list at this early stage could be long, could have 5, 7, 10 vendors. And then at this step, we recommend doing an RFI, a simpler evaluation technique to qualify the different vendors. Once you have done the RFI and you have qualified the different vendors, and by the way, at this stage, you may do a short demo with each of these vendors, but the qualification is maybe potentially about, are they in the price range? Are they in the right geography? Are they in the right industry? And once we have done that, we may shortlist from the original 5, 7, 10 to maybe 2, if it's really good, and maybe, if not, then maybe 3 vendors. By really good, I simply mean that it's selecting 1 out of 2 is a lot easier than selecting 1 out of 3, but sometimes it's not possible to get down to 2 that quickly. At this time, and only at this time, I would float a detailed RFP where you would have the functions, features, IT questionnaire, process questionnaire. This can be very detailed. and you may have a methodology about how to weigh the responses. Where do you want to put more weight? Where do you want to put less weight? And those types of things. Certainly long demo, which may include use cases, maybe a little proof of concept of the type that says, hey, how would you solve this particular use case of mine? Show it to me using my data. Potentially discussion about IT security, integration, and then final decision and moving forward. So moving forward at this stage is simply the fact that you have signed a contract with a vendor. And now you have to do the actual implementation, which can be very easily 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, depending on what are all the modules that you're implementing. So with that background, let's jump into today's topic. And let's start with, let me make a statement that even the best software can fail if not implemented properly. And so then that raises the question, what do we mean by success? What does not failing really mean? And really, there's very clear answer on that. The answer is delivering on the promised business value. So we are not talking about hitting all the milestones and going through the steps and going live on the right date. Yes, those things are important, but at the end, if you're not delivering the business value, then you are not successful. And that obviously can have financial elements like return on investment or saving this cost or increasing that profit. It can have an element of customer satisfaction. It can have elements of process improvements. Maybe you are able to do things better, faster. There can be learning and growth of your team. And it can be all four of these areas or multiple of these areas or just one of these areas. But the idea is that you want to make sure that you define success as delivering on the promised business value. So let's do our first poll of the day. And since you are on this webinar, let's ask the question, what is currently driving the need for supply chain planning software implementation in your organization? Now, Kristen will open the polls here, and you can certainly select multiple answers. So answers that we have listed are poor customer service, maybe high costs related to purchasing and production, etc. Too much cash sitting in inventory or account receivables, maybe something else. So we'll leave that open, and we will see if we'll see what kind of results come in. All right, so with 75% or so people voting here, it seems we have a lot of emphasis on too much cash stuck in inventory and accounts receivable, and roughly equivalent are saying something else. I would be curious to learn what that something else is, but that's for some other time. So let's keep rolling. So supply chain planning solution, the implementation is all about business value. So even though it's a software and it's an IT project of sorts, it's very important to understand that this type of a project is very much a business improvement project, a business transformation project. And so we need to understand and document the business value very clearly, and then use that document to be our North Star, to really guide us to where we are going. And certainly, as I said in one of the previous slides, there can be multiple deliverables towards value. It can be a list of things that we can do better, we can do faster, maybe both. So if I may just give you a few examples, on the side of being better, it could be things like I want higher forecast accuracy, or it could be that I want higher market share, or it could be that I want lower costs. On the side of being faster, it could be things like I want faster planning cycles, or I want faster turnover of inventory, which in a way is also better, but you get the idea. So you have to clearly document the business value and use that as your North Star. Now, when we think about the path to business value, if you're starting from the as-is state and you're going towards the future state, as you get there, you begin to see some better results, better value business to the business. And if that happens, then you will see your business being transformed towards doing things in a newer, better way. If there's no value, trust me, slowly but surely, people will go back to the old ways. So typically we see is the path that we see is people implement, people use, and there's typically a cycle. So that's in this first half of this graphic. There's a cycle where people say, what I did is not exactly right. Let me refine. So there's an implement, use, and refine cycle that happens sometimes as part of the project, but sometimes can also be after going live because learnings can come after. Anyway, if you do it well, and if you do the refinement and people are beginning to use it, slowly but surely you get it institutionalized. Everyone then relies on the new system, new way of working, which in that turn then returns and results in business value. Now, sometimes these software solution implementations also allow us to refine the business processes in parallel. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming slides. All right, so let's talk about what makes a supply chain planning solution implementation successful. And again, by successful, we are talking about resulting in business value and eventually a business transformation. So there are certain seeds of change that companies need in order for these things to be successful. And just from left to right, it has to do with the right leadership involvement. It has to do with the clarity on the business value, the clarity on business process. A lot of good communication is needed. A lot of good change management is needed. So let's take them one at a time. When we talk about senior leadership, what we are saying is that we need a strong, active, and visible sponsorship throughout the project. In other words, these are people who will attend meetings from time to time, who will make sure that they're directing the people, they are encouraging the people, they are able to provide any help in terms of technology, in terms of funding. By being involved, they can give us the much needed legitimacy in terms of running these types of projects. And then last but not the least, if we run into obstacles, the senior leaders can help us clear these obstacles by using their connections and their reach. So we need senior leadership engagement, and we need it to be present, we need it to be approachable, and we need it to be positive or encouraging, in other words. So let's see if you have run into this. So that's poll number 2. How do you feel about bringing concerns to your senior leadership when you are doing a project of this nature or have done a project of this nature? Are you intimidated that you don't want them to think that you cannot do this yourself? Are you reluctant? Are you willing? Are you a bystander? So the polls are open, and we'll be happy to see how you vote on this one. Fantastic. So everyone who voted that my managers are welcoming of the feedback, which is fantastic, which is exactly what you would like your management to be when you're doing a complex project of this kind. All right, let's talk about business value. So as I said, a project of this nature is only successful if our eyes are very clearly targeting the business value. And so how do we get that? Well, it comes from use of the new system. It's a fair statement to say that an implementation that does not get used is just wasted effort. So how do you ensure usage? Well, you have to take the people along. You have to apply the appropriate change management techniques. And sometimes it will so happen that you will see the J curve of improvement where really the performance first dips before it gets better. So keep that in mind, because if you do see early on that your performance is actually getting worse, keep the faith, because if you have done things right and you keep driving, eventually it'll go towards the right direction and you will see that business value for yourself. So keep in mind that business value comes from use. Very important to make sure that you're taking the people along so that they actually use the new system and drive it towards value. Next is business process. Anytime we are talking about a new supply chain planning system, remember that this is a business system, not a pure IT automation system. So you have to review the business processes and performance metrics. Your software is going to be integrated with multiple business processes throughout the organization. And sometimes they will be within your control, supply chain control, but sometimes it'll be within IT's control, but sometimes it can be outside. Maybe finance department is needing some data. So anytime you have a project like this, having a fair idea of where you are touching the business process is going to be very important. And if there are incremental process transformation needed, then it is a best practice to do it alongside the software implementation. On the other hand, if you need wholesale process changes, then of course you may need a brand new project where you may have to hire an external consultant to run the project for you. Communication, again, very important. In this type of project where we are talking about transformation, we need to have a clear and compelling, and at the same time as concise as possible, picture of the future vision and strategic direction. That means that we have to communicate broadly, consistently, and very widely, as well as when needed, giving a lot of details. Important part of this communication is to include the why, because sometimes the communication stops at the what, and that's not enough if you want to drive change. You need to convince people that this is a journey worth taking, and that means you have to provide the why as well. You have to manage expectations because you don't want the expectations to run ahead or run behind of the project. And last thing that I would say about communication is in this type of a project is that you want to have a results-driven mindset, results-driven orientation of your communication, not purely an activity-centered orientation. Now, some amount of activity-centered orientation in this communication is needed, don't get me wrong, but still use that value, business value, as your North Star, which means your documentation also should have a results-driven orientation. So that gets us to our third polling question. For those of you who have been involved in a system transformation of this kind, how much was the process around the new system discussed? Was it completely ignored? So process, what process? Well, we didn't change the process at all, just the tools. We just automated. The process was updated before the system was implemented. The process was updated alongside the system was implemented. So we'll look for your votes here. Okay, so this one is interesting. So far, it's getting a very wide set of responses, which is great. All right, so we are a minute in. So about a third said that process was not changed. It was split between the first and the second response. And the next third said it was updated before the system implementation, and the last third said it was updated alongside, so which is good, a fair mix. Again, my suggestion is first of all, you should always look at both of them together, and incremental changes do make sense to do alongside the system implementation. But if there are wholesale changes, then of course you need a separate project. All right, so since we talk a lot about change, we have to now think about a person who will manage or master or guide the change. So either you can call it project champion, change manager, change master, whatever terminology you like. So this change master is a very important person in a project of this nature where we are talking about business transformation. Their role is to make sure that this change happens. So in that sense, the activities they should be participating in are communicating inspiring visions so that people can see where we are going and why this is important, enlisting backers and supporters. Sometimes they are in the project, sometimes they are outside, and then of course monitoring if the things are actually working. So let's look at some of these one at a time. So communicating inspiring visions could simply be a clear, compelling, concise picture of the future vision and strategic direction. The purpose of this communication, especially through inspiring version of this communication, is to break any inertia that may exist. People don't necessarily change for the sake of change. They need to see the reason why they're going through this extra trouble, because believe it or not, in most modern organizations, these implementations are typically done alongside the day job. And so people are participating over and above what they are doing on a daily basis. And so if we don't show them the why, they may not be willing to put that extra work. So we have to make sure they clearly see the why and how it will pay off for them personally as well as for their team. When it comes to enlisting the backers and supporters, we are talking about potentially pre-selling the idea to certain people, present the idea even before the project was approved. Maybe it was even before it was fully developed. Sometimes it involves making deals, hey, if you help me here, I will give you this particular report or this particular enhancement or include this in the scope. And then you want to, of course, have these backers and supporters give a sanity check for you, because if they are the right backers and supporters, they probably have a lot of business experience and they can guide you where your ideas are wrong, and they can give you a quick sanity check if you want, if you like. So a key need for enlisting these backers and supporters is to over communicate with them. All right, so now we'll talk about we have talked a little bit about the things that allow for this change to happen, and believe me, this is a transformational type of a project when you are implementing a supply chain planning solution. Now the question is, what are the steps that we go through as part of the project? Now, anyone who has done this type of project knows this document called the scope of work document. So imagine we have all the right things. We have the business value, we have the leadership support, we have actually selected the vendor, we have an appropriate project champion who is willing and able to be the change master. Now we are getting into the project, and the first thing most people will type up or work on is the scope of work, or the SOW document. It's famous enough that everyone knows it by its acronym, SOW. The SOW should be thought of as the what of the project. So what are we going to do? So that means in this document, we are listing what are the modules in scope. Are we implementing demand? Are we implementing demand and inventory? Are we implementing implementing supply and things of that nature? Then you have the notion of high-level timeline. The timeline that is related to this SOW is not down to the week by week, module by module level. It is at a relatively high level, but we want to have a high-level timeline here, which we will develop further as part of the design workshop and so on, which I'll talk about in a second. We want to list things like milestones. We want to have risks clearly outlined in this document. We want to document what kind of training approach we will take. Will it be a train the trainer approach? Will it be on-site training? Will it be a training provided via Teams? Will it be online videos? What kind of documentation will be provided? The user testing and acceptance, how will we go about that? How much time will we make available for the users to do the testing? What will be the acceptance criteria? Then creating some kind of a RACI matrix which says who is responsible, accountable, who's communicated, who's informed. These are different facets of things that go into the SOW document. Last but not the least, the SOW has to be very aware that no matter how careful we are in defining the original scope, there will be things that will come up as part of the project that will need to be added into the scope. So to be fair to everybody, one should have a clear outlining of how we will document this change, how we will fund this change, and how we will go about through a process to include extra things into the scope of the project. So that's the scope of work document. And just to give you a sense of high-level timeline that you would need in an SOW document, you are listing on, if you look at this table here, it's not the most detailed, and it's saying, yeah, I have a data step, I have a design step, I have an implementation step, training, go live, aftercare, and roughly month 1 is when I start, and how long is the data step running, how long is the design step running, where is the implementation happening, where is the training happening, and so on. Obviously, if you have any kind of complexity in your project, then this here will not be enough. You will need to do a lot more or have a lot more detail. And that's where we will get into the next workshop, which is the data workshop and the design workshop. All right, so now we have an SOW, and remember what I said, it's the what of the project, and it has some detail there, but it's not obviously the most detailed document. Next step to make the whole implementation successful is to go about a data workshop. So planning the supply chain, and this webinar is all about supply chain planning software implementation. So planning the supply chain does require a lot of data. It's very data intensive. And the types of data we need are both master data, things like products and customers and locations and so on. But it's also transactional data, things like demand, and shipments and transfers and planning data, things like bill of materials and production rates and those types of things. So a lot of different types of data are needed. And this means that there must be a system in place that keeps track of all these data. Typically it's a transactional kind of system. Because data needs are intense, the transactional system acts like a foundational backbone to provide us this data on top of which the supply chain planning system can be implemented. So luckily for all of us, and hopefully this is true for every participant, there is typically an ERP system within the company, be it SAP, Oracle, JD Edwards, Microsoft Dynamics, whatever it might be. And so if you have the ERP system, a lot of the need for transaction type of data as well as master data is covered from there. So now as part of the data workshop, we want to assess the data, the state of the data. We want to see, for example, hey, how many systems we will be integrating with? What is the quality of the data there? Are we talking about 100 products? Are we talking about 300,000 products? Because obviously the quantity of the data can really, change the course of the project. Then data diagnostics. Are we going to leave it for the users to find the errors in this data, or are we going to help them and surface the issues in the data? And then last but not the least, who owns this data? Who is going to give us this data or connection to the data source so that we can pull it out? So a lot of these things go into this data workshop, and the output of the data workshop should very clearly list the systems to which we will integrate, as well as what we will pull out of those systems, or in some cases push back into. And then of course the sources of those data, and whether or not we will be doing full data load every time, or whether we will be doing a delta load. Full load would mean, for example, if I'm looking at 3 years of sales history, I will download 3 years of sales history every night, which might be excessive. And so delta load could simply be, I'll download the 3 years one time, and then from that point on, I will only download the delta, the things that have changed. So new things that have been added, or maybe some orders, existing orders that have been changed. All right, so that's the output of the data workshop. And as I said, the supply chain planning solution is very data intensive. So data workshop is a very, very important step, and it must be done after writing the SOW, but separate from the design workshop. But right after the data workshop, maybe within a week, maybe within 2 weeks, we should have the design workshop. So the design workshop, the idea is to establish a strong foundation for change. Remember, this is a transformation project, not just a software implementation project. So we have to come into this design workshop and clearly communicate the project goals, clearly align all the stakeholders. We have to have a look into the as-is situation and make sure everyone, including the vendor, knows what the as-is situation looks like. Follow that with the to-be situation, and we need to document all that. Then we need to determine what will be the milestones of this project. When will we release functionality to the users? And then as part of this design workshop, almost always you will find out that what was discussed in the data workshop sometimes needs tweaking. And so then that becomes a question of let's finalize that data requirements at the end of the design workshop and make sure everything is consistent. All right, so let's talk about documenting the current state and the future state, or as is and the to be. And so there are many different methodologies around this. My favorite methodology is to create a wiring diagram or a flow chart showing clearly who, what, when. And so you may start with the current state, and that may be a very simple, because companies may be coming from an Excel, Microsoft Excel viewpoint, and they might have only 5 steps. Although this is not to say that there cannot be complex processes in Excel, but let's just, if you go with my example, let's say if you're coming from a relatively simple as-is process, the new system may enable capabilities that allows you to do more. So you may publish a working wiring diagram where your roles, the different roles of people who are involved, are on the left side here, and across the top, across the width of the page is basically your timeline. And in this timeline, you have all the steps. So some steps, since this example is from a demand planning project, a lot of the steps are related to demand. And so these are done by the demand planner or demand manager. But then there are steps related to salespeople. So this process, as you can see, dips into the salesperson, and then in some cases dips into the sales manager. So very clearly highlighting who does what and in what part of the process is a key part of this wiring diagram or a flow chart or whatever other construct you may have. The idea is that in the design workshop, we should clearly document the as is and the to be processes. Then the purpose of the design workshop is to convert the what that we discussed in the SOW. So these are the things we are going to do into the how. And so really one clearly needs to document this on a per module basis. So if we are doing a demand implementation and an inventory implementation, I expect, and certainly I recommend for a successful implementation, that we have a per module document or design document, one for demand, one for inventory, one for supply. It has to be, excuse me, more detailed than the SOW. The typical ratio that I think works is somewhere between 1:5 to 1:10. So if SOW is 5 pages, the design workshop should be between 25 and 50 pages. That's the level of detail you will have by the time your design workshop is done. You want to finalize your data needs, and as well as you want to finalize and have it in much more detail, the timeline needs. Now, in the design workshop, we are going to make the claim that we will do things in 8 months relative to the data availability date. Sometimes people forget how data intensive these projects are. And so you may publish an 8-month timeline where the assumption is that in month 1, the data will be made available. And if the data takes 6 months to become available, sometimes the users still think that the go live date is not going to change. Well, that needs to be clearly communicated, that these projects are very data intensive, and the project timeline is relative to the data availability date. So if the data is not available for 6 months, then the go live date also needs to be pushed back by that same amount of time. Then the design workshop also needs to have a plan to make it happen. This idea that this is slightly different from just publishing the timeline. We are talking here about how we will take the users along, how will we take them from here to there being the to-be state. So for this reason, each step or each module should have a kickoff meeting, which should be clearly outlined in the design document, as well as an ending retrospective meeting, and each step should have its own wiring diagram. Now you will see here in the picture on the right, we have after each step, there is a short and a long pause. And the idea is that the pause is to institutionalize a change. People should have the time to make sure that they can use the system in their process. So as mentioned earlier, any implementation of this kind, there's an opportunity to tweak the process as well. But very importantly, what I'm trying to say here is that these long pauses are very important to take the users along, and therefore should be part of the program that we publish at the end of the design workshop. Here's a sample agenda. So you can see here, we are reviewing the current or the as-is process. We are talking about the future process. Then we are basically going through 2-3 days to document all the things we will do, where the data will come from, what the outputs might be, finalizing the data requirements, wrapping up. Once you have done the workshop, it typically takes about 2 weeks for the vendor to write up the design document, and there might be few iterations with you to make sure that we are capturing everything the correct way. A picture of the detailed timeline. As I mentioned earlier, the design workshop timeline should be a relative timeline. It should be relative to the day of the data availability. I have participated in some projects where this has led to some let's just say, unhappiness. So making it very clearly visible in the plan that the timeline at the end of the design workshop is relative to the day of data is very, very important. All right, so that's your very important design workshop. So at this time, we have written the SOW, we have done the data workshop and documented data. We have done the design workshop, we have done the design documentation and finalized the data requirements. Now we are ready to have a kickoff meeting where we say, look, we have done the preliminary. Now let's kick it off, maybe with some fanfare, maybe without. Sometimes this is done on site, sometimes it is done online. By contrast, data and design workshops are always done on site. You want to have a good engagement between the teams. So the kickoff meeting is done typically after the design document is completed. You are now confirming your project plan and key milestones. This might be a good opportunity for someone from the leadership team or the project sponsor typically, to make a little speech about how important this project is. And then in this meeting, we have to emphasize once again the timing of the data availability and the data integration. We have to highlight any and all events that could impact timeline. We have to think about the resource requirement from you, the customer. And then we can close out this meeting by saying, look, we have this design document, we have this data document, it has been checked multiple times with the users. Let's go ahead and start the project. Now, we will talk a little bit about aligning the teams and driving the user engagement. And so one of the key methodologies that Arqiva likes to talk about is the rapid iterative delivery. What is needed in these projects is very often cross-functional collaboration. You will have multiple people from different departments and you want them to work together. And almost always there's change management involved. So you're coming from an as-is process and you're going towards a to-be process. So you have to think about what are the best practices and strategies to overcome resistance to change. Then you have to think about user engagement. So all these things require for us to get everybody excited, get them to provide their, not just the work, but also their input early and often. And we have to encourage them to say, hey, don't be too bogged down by the decision you made last week. If now, as you are learning more about the system, if you need to revise something, let us do it now. So it's an iterative process. People change their mind often, and we should encourage that. I mean, within reason, of course, they cannot change the whole scope, but if they said last month that, hey, stat forecast, in the last meeting, if they said the stat forecast should be run in the second week of the month, but now they want to change it to the third week of the month, we should allow that as part of this process. So how do you do that? Well, you do that by running the project with this mindset of rapid iterative delivery, where you publish the timeline in a way that you have business releases. So if you see this picture here, if all the way on the left is the kickoff, then the number 2, 3, 4, 5, these numbers are basically business releases. We are allowing a user to say, at this time, at this milestone, you will have the system in your hands. You will be able to play with the data. You will be able to click around. You will be able to run your own reports. It's not fully functional, of course, but there are things that we have made available. For example, at the end of the first milestone, you can slice and dice your input data. At the end of the second milestone, you can see the statistical forecast and maybe provide your own forecast input. At the end of the third milestone, we may be able to look at metrics and KPIs and so on. So this idea of business releases, which aligns loosely with the agile methodology of running software projects, is very important in the supply chain world. If you don't do that, then you cannot carry the users along, and that typically leads to an unsuccessful project. Now we talk about testing, training, and validation. Very important. The vendor does not know your business. They can look at numbers and give it a pass because the numbers are just numbers. As long as they match the previous system, that's the end of all the validation that a vendor can do. Users Of course, one look at the data and they know this is wrong or something is good or not good. So we need to make sure the users are participating in the testing of the data. That means that we have to ensure that we are giving them time. The testing is also best done in rapid iterations. By if they give us the feedback in the morning, by next day we should have an answer ready for them, an explanation. So there should be a very intensive iterative testing time period. Sometimes people need test scripts, and we can certainly get the vendor to provide you the test scripts. Very important to simulate business scenarios as part of this test. So what if my plant were to go down? Well, let's simulate that through the system to see what will that do in the when it actually happens. So let's simulate that now so that we are prepared for when it actually happens out in the future. So a lot of iterations, therefore a lot of feedback is needed. Okay, so if we have done this, we have gone through the testing, we have gone through the training, we have gone through the feedback and all that. So hopefully we are able to then go live. And so now we need a post go live support plan where we are very interested in asking the users to use the software, number one, with an eye on the business value. So remember, we started this whole conversation by saying business value is the king. So now we have to get their eyes trained back on that business value, use that as the North Star to say, how are we measuring up against that? So use your KPIs to measure your success vis-a-vis those business values that you decided early on. And then you have to plan for enhancements. As soon as the users begin to use, no matter how good your design workshop was, no matter how good your SOW was, people will find issues. You know, an analogy I like to use is if you buy a car, you need to do an oil change and other types of maintenance from time to time. Similarly, with this system, it's a brand new system. People have not used it. Now they are beginning to use it. They will say, hey, if only this was done this other way, this would have been easier for me. So plan for that. Have some budget ready for that and provide them those enhancements to the users, because that is what will make the difference between using and not using. And for that reason, you definitely want to maintain the relationship with the vendor or the partner who did the implementation so that you can do these enhancements going forward. All right, so we've gone through a lot of these steps. Now let's look at some softer side of the system transformation. And some of them obviously should be very commonsensical. We need, of course, project execution. We need to make sure we are nurturing the working team because the team is working hard. We have to be prepared for setbacks and so be ready to persist and persevere. And we have to be willing and able to celebrate the accomplishments as we go along. So let's look at all of them. So project execution, this simply means that we need to know that there will be issues and we have to be proactive in solving those issues. The approach we suggest is the agile approach, which is a very iterative approach. This is what I meant earlier by the rapid iterative delivery. This allows us to engage the users quickly, to solicit feedback, and then provide them corrections and improvements in a very quick iteration as well. So as we do that, the users come along very nicely. They feel invested in the new solution, and therefore they feel the need to use the system. And once the use happens is when the business value really shows up. Without use, there is no business value. So this agile approach, if I have not said it enough, let me say it very, very strongly one more time, that it's very, very important to take the users along so that you get the business value out of the system. Of course, effective project management would mean you have to manage scope creep, you have to manage your timelines, you have to keep an eye on all that, which any good project manager would do for you. Now let's talk about the working team itself. So in the early part of the project, we built the team to do this. Now, as we go along, the softer side is to nurture the team. So when we are making the team, we have to think about, hey, we need to have the right people on the team. They need to be able to identify with this project. They need to have respect for each other. They need to be fully bought in. So they should have the desire to do whatever it takes to make it successful. They should be convinced in the business value that we are trying to get them to. Let them take ownership. Let them work out some of the details themselves. Nurturing, on the other hand, can be things like we have to make sure that they can get the resources that they need. If they need access to a particular user who was not part of the team, a particular, maybe they need to be protected, or we need to save them from any distractions that might come along. So that is very important to make sure that the working team is nurtured as this project goes along, again, for the success of the project. Then, as anyone who has done this type of a project knows, there will be surprises. Your money will run out. Someone will fall sick. Some business issue will pop up, and for all these reasons, you will have a slowdown in momentum. Maybe your critics who didn't want this project in the first place, they will get louder. They will get some energy from it. So what we are suggesting here is these things will happen. So plan for it and plan to persist and persevere. If you had thought upfront about all this and you knew this was important for you, you have to then be prepared for all these distractions and persist and persevere right through them, because otherwise it'll become very easy to leave the project at the first setback. And then you have to celebrate accomplishment. So what that means is a mini win. I think I said this earlier, the change manager has to provide the inspiring visions and keep a positive approach to this project so that the whole team remains positively motivated. So what that means is one of the ways you can do that is celebrate the accomplishment, not just at the end, although it's important to celebrate at the end, but also throughout the project. So, have mini milestones, celebrate them. Maybe there is a place for off-site. Maybe there is a place in the middle of the project to do a team building exercise. Maybe there is a place for a recognition, because maybe that provides a good morale boost, or maybe it provides good publicity. So very important to celebrate the accomplishments of the team, be it from the vendor side or from the user side, as we go along in this project. All right, so that is kind of what I wanted to talk about. Let me conclude here with a few summary remarks, and then we'll do some questions. So first and foremost, you have to run a supply chain planning system implementation like a business project, business improvement, business transformation, whatever words you like, not like a pure IT automation project. Very, very important. So focus on the said business value, keep that as your North Star, and chase that all the time. Get support from leadership. You will need that because times will get rough and you will need that support. Practice good change management techniques. Focus on that. Roll things out in iterations, because you cannot present all these changes in one go. It doesn't work. And of course, enjoy the resulting business value. So that's what I wanted to talk about. And with that said, let me turn this back over to Kristen.
Great, thank you, Sujit. That was very informational. We do have a couple questions that came in, so we'll get to those. And just a reminder that if you do have a question, you can submit it using the questions window within the webinar platform. So the first question we have here says, McKinsey says that 70% of transformations fail. What would you say are best practice change management practices to be successful?
I mean, it's kind of like, I would say this whole webinar is aligned with that question. But, if I had to highlight a couple, I would say things like making sure that you are rolling things out in an iterative way, making sure that you have made up your mind that you will persist and persevere even when you go through the J curve, where you first dip below before you make the improvement, making sure you have buy-in from the leadership. Those would be my top three to make sure that the change actually happens. I'm not surprised by the 70% number. I would have put it probably a little bit lower, but let's just go with that. A lot of these projects lately have been dubbed digital transformation projects and are often implemented as a purely IT project. And I can assure you, a supply chain project, which is run purely as an IT project, is bound to fail. So if that number is 60% of the projects are being sold purely as an IT project and not as a business project, then I would say all of those, I would be very surprised how any of them succeed. So that would be my recommendation. Those 3 items plus just remembering this is all about business. IT is involved. Yes, it is a software technology project, but keep your eyes on that business value, and that'll increase your chances of success. Kristen?
Okay, excellent, thank you. We have another one that came in as well. It is, let's see, it says, you say that process improvement should be a separate project alongside the system implementation, but shouldn't they be the same project? Because without the process changes, the systems won't be effective, and without the system, the new process won't be effective.
What I was trying to say, maybe it did not come across very well, is that wholesale project process changes, should be done as a separate project prior, not after, but prior to the implementation, if such a change is needed. If, on the other hand, wholesale changes are not needed and only incremental changes are needed, then they should be done as part and parcel of this project. I totally agree with the questioner. If you are going to implement the system or a new system and then come around immediately and do a process change project, whether wholesale or incremental, then you are doing these things in the wrong order. So I would definitely either do it upfront as a separate project or alongside, especially if they are incremental changes. Process changes should not be on the tail end of the implementation, software implementation. So if that's how somehow it came across, let me be very clear. Process is either in the beginning, in upfront, or side by side. Upfront mostly when it's wholesale changes, side by side when mostly it's incremental changes. So hopefully that clarifies.
Yes, thank you. Let's see, we have another one. How early should IT teams be brought into the integration planning process?
Basically right there from the beginning of the SOW document. And in fact, let's be clear, even in the selection process, IT teams are involved. So I would say right in the selection process, they should be in the committee, and then of course throughout the project.
Okay, great. And what are the most important KPIs to track in the first 90 days after go live?
I would say first 90 days is too short for business value, although you might be able to say, okay, statistical forecast, for example, if you're doing a demand project, yes, the statistical forecast in the new system is better than the statistical forecast in the old system. But 90 days might be too short to see business value, given that the length of the project itself is sometimes 4, 5, 6 months. So I would track things like use, how often is the user logging on? How often are they making overrides into the system? Use is what I would track very heavily in the first 90 days.
Okay, great. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. We do hope that you'll join us for our next live webinar, and more information will be available soon for that. And as a reminder, please take a few moments to answer the short survey at the end of the webinar. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.